She left the interview room with a heavy heart, feeling that the world had never given her a fair chance. But when the door closed behind her, the unthinkable happened. The most powerful man in that building, a millionaire who had never noticed her existence, ran after her. What he saw in that simple single mother would change not only her destiny, but his own as well. This is the story of Grace Miller, and how dignity, courage, and love for a child can turn the tide when all seems lost. Grace Miller moved unnoticed through the glass-walled corridors of a Seattle tech company, pushing her cart while the city slept. She had worked there for 3 years as a night cleaner, knowing every room better than many of the daytime employees. She was a single mom trying to maintain her dignity in silence, even when exhaustion spoke louder. Since the accident that took her husband's life, she had learned to move forward without guarantees. She raised Emily alone, balancing long shifts with simple household chores. Nothing in the routine seemed extraordinary, but everything demanded courage. And that courage was rarely seen. The nights were long, and the sound of the keys being switched off echoed like a reminder of a world that didn't include her. Grace cleaned desks where important decisions were made, even though she was never asked for her opinion. Bills piled up in her bag along with crumpled receipts and overdue notices. Still, she made a point of arriving home with a smile, preserving her sense of family that was all that remained. Emily slept when she left and was still asleep when she returned. This silent distance was the price of survival. But deep down, Grace believed that it wouldn't last forever. There were days when hope seemed too small to fit in her chest. She had already experienced enough rejection to recognize the weight of it. Failed interview without even having been called. Even so, she possessed something rare. Self-worth. Even though fragile, she didn't see herself as a victim, only as someone on pause. She knew she had value, even if the world insisted on not confirming it. Every flaw cleared was proof of perseverance. Every dawn overcome reinforced her resilience. Before everything fell apart, Grace worked at a busy hotel, dealing with all kinds of people. She learned early on that empathy, it opens doors that titles can't. That version of her seemed distant, but not erased. Sometimes, passing through the company reception, she remembered how much she enjoyed helping. It wasn't just work, it was purpose. Life pushed her away from that, but didn't take away her essence. She still believed in kindness, even when I didn't get any back. At that company, few knew her name, but many benefited from her efforts. Grace observed the screens, the motivational posters, the speeches about innovation and humanity. There was irony in it all, and she perceived it. Still, she harbored no resentment, only silence. The prejudice was subtle but constant, like background noise. Even so, she continued, steadfast, night after night. Perseverance was her form of resistance. One ordinary morning, while cleaning the administrative hallway, something different caught her attention. A simple, almost forgotten piece of paper stuck to the wall seemed out of place. She read it slowly, as if not wanting to deceive herself. She felt her heart slow down and speed up at the same time. It wasn't just a warning, it was an opportunity. Something inside her awakened, bringing hope and fear in equal measure. Grace stood there for a few seconds, holding the broom handle as if it were an emotional support. She thought of Emily, of everything she had lost and what she could still achieve. It seemed like a silent invitation to second chance, but it was also a test. She knew that taking this step would require facing stares, judgments, and perhaps another rejection. Still, something told her that this story wasn't over, and without realizing it, she was already preparing for the next move. The notice on the wall seemed too simple to make any impact, but the words kept echoing in Grace's mind. Administrative assistant position, business hours, Full benefits. She read it more than once, as if the text could disappear. It didn't promise luxury, but it offered stability, something that had vanished from her life years ago. Business hours meant family dinners, weekends off, real presents. Full benefits meant security for Emily. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't just seem like survival, it seemed like possibility. With her phone in hand, Grace impulsively snapped a picture of the sign. The click resonated louder than it should have in that empty hallway. It wasn't just a photo. It was a way of seizing that opportunity before fear took over. She put her phone back in her pocket, feeling her heart beat faster. Something different had awakened, a mixture of enthusiasm and caution. That small gesture seemed like a silent commitment to herself. Still, doubt began to creep in. What if it wasn't meant for her? As she continued her work, Grace observed the building with different eyes. She knew every room, every shortcut, every routine that took place inside. She knew the peak hours, the names on forgotten name tags, the details that no one noticed. That place was part of her life, even though she had never been truly invited to participate. She understood the workings of that company more than they imagined. This gave her a shy, almost hidden confidence. At the same time, it reminded her that knowledge doesn't always overcome prejudice. The thought of a new failed interview, he appeared without asking permission. He remembered closed doors with polite smiles and vague answers. She remembered what it's like to leave believing you did your best and still not be chosen. That old pain still had a voice. The idea of reliving it threatened her. Dignity, Grace wasn't afraid of hard work, but she dreaded being invisible again. The silence after a "we'll be in touch" still weighed heavily on her. She thought about how many times she had convinced herself not to try, how many opportunities she had let pass by because she thought she wasn't good enough. That bothered her more than any rejection. Not trying meant accepting the place the world had chosen for her. And Grace had already lost too much to continue accepting everything in silence. Her self-worth, she needed space, even if she was trembling. Perhaps it was time to choose courage over comfort. As she pushed the stroller down the hallway, she thought about Emily growing up and watching her every choice. What kind of example did she want to set? A mother who gave up out of fear, or a woman who tried despite it? The answer came without words. Grace believed in hope even when she seemed fragile. She knew that resilience lessons can also be taught through quiet actions. That position wasn't just about work, it was about the future. And the future began with a decision. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that choice settle in her chest. There were no guarantees, only the chance to be seen beyond the uniform. Grace still didn't know how she would do it, or if it would work. She only knew that something had been awakened and couldn't be ignored. The warning remained there, motionless, but inside her, everything was in motion. And that night, fear wasn't enough to extinguish it, because something was pushing her forward, even without promises. Before donning her cleaning uniform, Grace wore a different kind of badge, one that put her face to face with people all day long. She worked for years in a busy hotel where she learned to listen more than to speak. She received tired guests, confused families, solitary travelers, and treated everyone with the same attention. There, she discovered that empathy, it wasn't something you learned from manuals. It came from a look, a tone of voice, patience. She enjoyed that silent exchange. Serving people gave meaning to her days. Grace remembered the feeling of solving small problems that seemed enormous to someone arriving tired. A room change, a lost suitcase, an order placed outside of mealtimes. None of that bothered her. On the contrary, she felt proud to help. That routine demanded it. Kindness, she was resourceful and respectful. It was a simple but dignified job. And for the first time in her adult life, she felt seen. That period still lived within her, even after everything had changed. Then came the call no one expects to receive. The accident took her husband in an instant, and with him went the plans, the stability, the ground beneath her feet. Grace didn't have time for prolonged mourning because Emily needed her whole. She left the hotel, left the fixed shifts, left behind a version of herself that seemed safe. She became both mother and father at the same time. Family survival became the absolute priority, even if it meant sacrificing their own dreams. Survival became the only possible goal. Taking care of her daughter alone required more than physical strength. It demanded courage to wake up every day without answers. It demanded perseverance to accept jobs that had never been part of the plan. Grace didn't complain, but she felt the change. The world began to treat her differently, colder, more distant. She realized the prejudice subtle against those who carry the weight of life on their faces. Still, he refused to lose his humanity. Sometimes, while cleaning silent hallways, memories would surface unannounced. The hotel reception desk, the ringing phone, the quick conversations with colleagues. It wasn't just nostalgia for the job, it was nostalgia for who she was back then. A confident woman, sure of her own worth. The question began to bother her. At what point had she stopped believing that? Perhaps she never really stopped. She just buried it too deeply. And now that memory insisted on returning. Grace began to connect the dots between the past and the present. The skills he possessed hadn't disappeared with the tragedy. Knowing how to deal with people, resolve conflicts, remain calm under pressure, it was all still there. What was lacking wasn't ability, it was opportunity. This realization affected her self-worth. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to think that maybe it hadn't been a setback. Maybe it was just a painful detour. Doubt, however, followed soon after, as it always did. Had too much time passed to ask for one second chance? Would the world still have room for her outside the shadows? Grace had no answers, only a growing unease. Something inside her told her that this story needed redemption, and while the warning on the wall wouldn't leave her mind, the past made it clear that she wasn't starting from scratch. She was resuming something that had never truly died. That night, sleep wouldn't come, and Grace took it as a sign. She sat at the kitchen table, the house silent and the city still awake outside. She opened her old laptop and stared at the blank screen for long minutes. I didn't want to write something perfect. I wanted to write something true. Every word needed to carry weight. Dignity. I'm not exaggerating. That letter wasn't a cry for help, but an affirmation of who she was. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to try. Grace began by recounting her journey without embellishment. She spoke of the hotel, of caring for people, of her ability to learn quickly. She didn't hide the path that led her to night work, but she didn't diminish herself because of it either. She explained that she knew how to handle routines, pressure, and responsibility. She said she valued respect and collaboration. Nothing there was invented. She didn't need to lie to appear capable. She just needed to be honest. It was an exercise in self-worth. With each paragraph, she felt something reorganizing itself inside. It wasn't just a cover letter. It was almost a conversation with herself. She remembered how many times she had let others define her boundaries. This time, she chose to take a stand. She spoke about perseverance without using the word. He showed resilience without announcing it. He ended by explaining his desire to grow and learn, even starting from where he was. That vulnerability demanded courage. When she reached the end, she read it all again. It didn't look like a traditional resume, but it looked human. Grace took a deep breath before clicking send. The gesture lasted a second, but the impact was immediate. Her heart raced, her hands trembled. There was fear, yes, but also hope. She knew that decision would change something, even without a guarantee of a response. And, at that moment, that was enough. The following days were marked by silent waiting. Grace continued working, caring for Emily, outwardly maintaining her routine. Inside, however, each notification made her chest tighten. She tried not to get her hopes up, but it was impossible. The thought of the job opening would surface at the most random moments. Still, she remembered that she had done everything within her power. The rest was no longer up to her. On the third day, her cell phone vibrated while she was folding clothes on the sofa. An email with the company's name appeared on the screen. Grace hesitated before opening it, as if that second could protect her from possible disappointment. When she read, "Interview confirmed," the world seemed to slow down. It wasn't a promise, but it was an invitation, an opportunity, real, concrete. She closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of that chance. Grace knew that message didn't erase the past, nor did it guarantee the future. But it meant that someone had read her story and decided to listen to it. That was already a kind of respect. Fear still existed, but now it shared space with the possibility of redemption. She didn't know what she would find on the other side of that interview. She only knew that for the first time in a long time, she was walking towards something new, and that changed everything. The morning after the interview was confirmed, Grace began getting ready as if she were organizing more than just clothes. She knocked on her neighbor's door with a simple, slightly embarrassed request. The borrowed dress wasn't new, but it was well cared for, one of those that carry stories. Holding it in her hands, she felt a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. That piece represented collective effort, a small, silent support network. For Grace, that meant humanity. She promised herself she would honor that trust. Back in the apartment, she ironed with exaggerated attention, as if every fold needed to be impeccable. The steam rose slowly, keeping pace with her racing thoughts. It wasn't vanity. It was respect for the opportunity. As she smoothed the fabric, she rehearsed answers in a low voice. She spoke of experience, of learning, of commitment. She tried to sound confident, even when fear insisted on creeping in. It was a delicate balance between hope and caution. Standing before the mirror, Grace observed herself for longer than usual. She wasn't seeking perfection, she was seeking recognition. I wanted to see someone there who deserved that position. She adjusted her hair, took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders. She repeated phrases until they sounded natural. She didn't want to memorize answers. She wanted to convey truth. This was more than a professional test. It was a test of self-worth, and she knew it. Emily watched everything in silence, sitting on the sofa with her legs dangling. Her eyes followed her mother's every move, attentive and confident. At a certain moment, she broke the silence with a simple phrase, spoken effortlessly. "Mom, you're going to make it." There was no doubt in her voice, only certainty. Grace felt her chest tighten, overcome by an emotion difficult to explain. That confidence came from the person who mattered most. She smiled at her daughter, trying not to let the inner turmoil show. The smile was sincere, but it hid an old fear. The fear of being invisible again, of entering a room and being judged before even speaking. Grace knew this feeling well, a result of past experiences and sideways glances. Prejudice, it's not always declared, but it's always felt, and that scared her. While packing her bag, she thought about the weight of that interview. It wasn't just about a job, it was about changing the rhythm of their lives. More time together, more security, more hope, but it was also the possibility of hearing a no that would echo for a long time. Grace knew that she had courage, but courage doesn't eliminate fear. It only teaches you to walk despite it. And at that moment, walking seemed like the only option. Before leaving, Grace looked at Emily one last time. She thought about the silent example she was setting, regardless of the outcome. That attempt was already a start. Life lesson. Still, she longed to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. She took a deep breath and closed the door, taking with her more than just a resume. She carried the hope that this time the world would be willing to see her, even without knowing what awaited her on the other side. On the day of the interview, Grace arrived 30 minutes early, as she always did when something important mattered. She preferred to wait outside rather than risk being late. The building was alive in a way that was different from the night shift. Hurried people crossed the lobby talking loudly, laughing, balancing cups of expensive coffee in their hands. Everything there seemed fast, confident, automatic. Grace took a deep breath, trying to blend into the rhythm. This wasn't her routine, but it could be. While she waited, she observed the details she knew so well, now in a different light. The clean walls, the gleaming counter, the crowded elevators. She had always been there, but never like this. Seated with her bag on her lap and her resume neatly folded, she felt the weight of expectation. Each minute seemed too long. Still, she maintained a firm posture. Arriving early was part of the respect she had for the opportunity. When her name was called, Grace stood carefully. The sound of her own footsteps echoed louder than she expected. She walked down the hall, trying to keep her breathing steady. Upon entering the room, she found 3 people seated across the table. Quick, formal, rehearsed smiles. Everything seemed correct, but something was out of place. Before she could even ask, she felt it. It was a silent, almost instinctive recognition. Grace perceived in their eyes an assessment that went beyond the resume, a look that measures, compares, frames. It wasn't open hostility, it was something more subtle, a restrained curiosity, perhaps surprise. She understood that she was being judged before she spoke, not for what she could do, but for what she represented. That feeling was too familiar to ignore. Still, she sat calmly and maintained a serene tone. She answered the first questions clearly, speaking of experience, organization, and commitment. She used real examples, situations she had lived through. She tried to create a connection, but felt an invisible barrier. The atmosphere was polite, yet distant. There was no exchange, only analysis. Grace remained firm, but inside something was beginning to close up. The contrast between her and the setting became increasingly evident. The expensive watch on one wrist, the impeccable clothes, the quick glances exchanged between the interviewers. None of it was wrong, but it all communicated a difference. Grace felt the weight of not belonging in that space. Even though she was there, respect, it seemed, conditional, and that hurt more than a direct rejection. She continued responding, aware that she was doing her best. She didn't apologize for her past, nor did she try to fit into a mold that wasn't hers. She spoke with dignity, supported by history itself. Even so, the atmosphere didn't change. The silence between questions spoke louder than words. Grace began to understand that this interview already had a direction. Finally, as she thanked them for their attention, she felt a heavy certainty forming. It wasn't about performance, it was about perception, something that was already decided and not in her favor. She maintained her composure, but her heart slowed in a different way. That room, so brightly lit, seemed to close in around her. Grace didn't yet know how it would end, but she knew she was about to face something she already knew very well. The questions began to take on a different tone, more rigid, more distant. They wanted to know about college, courses, certifications that could be listed in objective terms. Grace answered calmly, explaining her path without beating around the bush. She didn't try to exaggerate achievements or hide gaps. She spoke of what she knew how to do, what she had learned in practice. She knew that degrees help, but she also knew that they don't define everything. Still, she felt that those answers weren't what they expected to hear. When asked about his current job, Grace hesitated for a brief second, not out of shame, but anticipating the impact. He clearly stated that he worked nights, cleaning the building. The air in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Gazes drifted away, then returned, different. There was no explicit contempt, just a subtle change in interest, as if, in that instant, something had been decided without words. The silence that followed was too heavy to ignore. One of the interviewers quickly jotted something down. Another adjusted his posture in his chair. Grace felt the space between her and them widen, even though she was sitting at the same table. Nothing I said afterward seemed to matter as much as that detail. The job she had at night began to speak louder than her experience. It was as if her identity had been reduced to a label. She continued responding with dignity, maintaining a firm and respectful tone. She didn't explain herself beyond what was necessary, nor did she try to justify her career path. Grace knew the value of her own effort. She knew that perseverance, it doesn't appear on certificates, but it shapes character. Even so, she realized that the room no longer saw her in the same way. The judgment didn't come from words, it came from assumptions. It was a type of prejudice. It was difficult to confront because it hid behind formality. No one said anything offensive, no one raised their voice, yet everything was being said. Grace felt that old sensation of being judged by her outward appearance, not her inner self. The interview continued, but the connection had been lost. She spoke, and the answers seemed to fall into an empty space. Inside, a silent conflict settled in. Part of her wanted to leave, to end it before it hurt more. Another part refused to back down. Grace remembered Emily, the letter written in the early morning, the courage that had brought her this far. She wasn't going to diminish herself to fit anyone's expectations. Maintaining her self-respect was more important than pleasing others. That was a line she wouldn't cross. She realized it wasn't about what she said, but about who they believed her to be. An image formed quickly, without context, without empathy. This saddened her, but didn't break her. Grace maintained her composure until the end, aware that she had done her best. Even feeling the weight of that silent judgment, she chose to leave with her head held high. What she didn't yet know was that this scene hadn't gone unnoticed by everyone. The ending came as no surprise, but it still hurt. "Thank you for coming," they said in neutral, rehearsed voices, devoid of warmth. There were no promises or explanations. Grace understood the meaning even before she stood up. That kind of farewell was already part of her history. It wasn't an outright no, it was worse. It was a no disguised as politeness. She took a deep breath, gathering what little composure she had left. Grace stood up calmly, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and thanked them for the opportunity. She didn't question, didn't insist, didn't ask for reconsideration. She had learned throughout her life that begging rarely changes decisions already made, maintaining the dignity. It was her way of protecting herself. Even feeling a tightness in her chest, she refused to diminish herself. That door might be closing, but she wouldn't let that define her. As she left the room, the hallway seemed longer than before. Each step carried the weight of silent rejection. There was no anger, only a profound weariness. Grace already knew that feeling, the mixture of frustration and forced acceptance. She thought of Emily, of the borrowed dress, of the hope she had taken with her. Everything seemed to slip through her fingers. Still, she kept walking. In the elevator, he avoided the mirror for a moment. He didn't want to see himself through the gaze he felt in the interview. When he finally faced his reflection, he found someone tired but whole, someone who had tried. That mattered more than the result. Grace held back tears until the doors closed. You wouldn't let that experiment steal your self-worth. The lobby was as busy as before, indifferent to her disappointment. People hurried past, laughing, talking on the phone, going about their lives. Grace crossed that space as one crosses a river in silence. No one noticed her departure, and that seemed to confirm everything. Still, she kept her head held high. There was no shame in trying. Outside, the cold Seattle air hit her face. She paused for a second before heading for the bus stop. She wondered if this had been her last attempt or just another hard lesson. The idea of redemption, it seemed distant at that moment, but something in her refused to give up completely. Even wounded, she still existed. Hope. What Grace didn't know was that the interview hadn't been as invisible as it seemed. On the other side of the internal cameras, someone was watching everything attentively. Someone who didn't look at her current position, but at her posture, her calmness, her self-respect. As she walked away believing that everything had ended there, another story began to unfold. And this part, still hidden, was about to change the course of everything. Ethan Reed watched the interviews from a distance on a large screen in his glass-walled office on the top floor. It was the Millionaire CEO from one of Seattle's most influential companies, accustomed to high numbers and quick decisions. This follow-up was part of a new corporate culture project, something he took seriously. He wanted to understand how people were evaluated when they thought no one important was watching. For Ethan, leadership was also about responsibility, and that morning seemed all too ordinary. The interviews followed a predictable pattern: correct answers, calculated smiles, well-rehearsed speeches. Ethan watched attentively, but without much emotional involvement. Until Grace entered the room, there was no immediate impact, just a strange feeling, difficult to define. He noticed something different in her posture, a calmness that didn't seem practiced. It was as if she wasn't there to impress, but to be honest. That caught his attention. As the conversation progressed, Ethan began to observe more than listen. He noticed the pauses, the exchanged glances, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. You saw when Grace talked about her night job. He also saw the exact moment when the interviewer's interest waned. Nothing explicit happened, but everything was clear. This did not escape his notice. The discomfort began to grow. When the interview ended and Grace stood up, Ethan felt an unexpected unease. It wasn't about her resume, it was about her attitude. The way she thanked him, how she left without explaining herself, carried a certain weight, dignity. There was a silent force there that contrasted with the coldness of the room. He leaned forward, as if trying to see better. Something about that scene seemed wrong. And Ethan didn't usually ignore that kind of feeling. As he watched Grace walk down the hallway on camera, a memory began to form. It wasn't vague, but it wasn't clear either. He was sure he'd seen her before in another context, outside of that interview. The image kept surfacing, but it wouldn't fully materialize. Ethan frowned, trying to connect the dots. That woman wasn't a stranger to him. He moved away from the table and began pacing the office, restless. The interview was over, but his attention remained there. He was thinking about the word empathy, so often mentioned in meetings and so rarely practiced. I was thinking about how much the company talked about it, humanity and inclusion. That scene called all of that into question. Ethan felt that something important had been ignored, and that bothered him deeply. As I mentally reviewed the images, the memory finally began to surface. A simple, everyday episode, but striking. Something involving care, urgency, and kindness. He stopped by the window, gazing at the city without truly seeing it. Certainty was beginning to take shape. Grace wasn't just another candidate. She was part of a story he hadn't forgotten. Meanwhile, on the ground floor, Grace was already walking away from the building, believing that everything had ended there. Ethan, however, was still trapped by that unsettling feeling. Something needed to be revisited, something needed to be corrected. And at that moment, he decided that he wouldn't let that doubt die in silence. The past was about to meet the present. Grace walked through the lobby with measured steps, trying to leave behind the interview that still echoed in her mind. She was already thinking about the way back, what she would say to Emily, how to reorganize her hope so it wouldn't hurt so much. The noise around her seemed distant, as if she were enveloped in a silent bubble. It was then that she heard her name, clear and firm, breaking through the hurried flow of the place. For a moment, she thought it was her imagination. No one usually called her there, much less in that way. She stopped and turned slowly, still confused. Ahead, walking with unusual haste, was Ethan Reed, the man who commanded everything, the familiar face from the internal news, the name mentioned in meetings she only heard from afar. He seemed determined, almost out of character. Grace felt her heart race, trying to make sense of the scene. Why was he talking to her? The entire lobby seemed to slow down. Conversations dwindled, steps hesitated, and glances turned in the same direction. People who hadn't noticed her before now observed her with open curiosity. Grace felt the weight of that sudden, uncomfortable, unexpected attention. She, who had always tried to be invisible, was now at the center of it all. The contrast was almost surreal. Ethan stopped before her, taking a deep breath, like someone who had made a decision on impulse. He called her name again, respectfully, as if to confirm that it was indeed her. Grace responded in a low, polite tone, still trying to understand what was happening. The difference between the two was evident to everyone. He, the Millionaire CEO, she, the cleaning lady who had just come from a rejected job interview. That image made no sense to the viewer. Grace felt a mixture of apprehension and confusion. She wondered if she had done something wrong, if there was a problem. Her first reaction was to shut down, to protect herself. Years of experience had taught her to expect the worst when someone in a position of power approached without warning. Still, she maintained her composure. Dignity, the man who had guided her out of the interview room, was now supporting her there in front of everyone. Ethan seemed to ignore the stares around him. There was something urgent in his expression, something that didn't fit with corporate protocols. He wasn't speaking yet, but his silence carried intention. Grace realized that this wasn't an ordinary conversation. Something important was about to be said, something that would change the course of that day. The air between them seemed thick with expectation. As everyone watched, a silent question hung in the air. Why would a man like Ethan Reed be chasing after someone like Grace Miller? What did he see that others didn't? Grace sensed that this encounter was no coincidence. And in that suspended moment, she still didn't know if it would bring relief or another wound. She only knew that the story was definitely not over yet. Ethan took a deep breath before speaking, like someone who had just connected pieces that had been loose for too long. He looked at Grace more closely, not as a CEO, but as someone pulling a memory from the depths of his mind. Months before, his mother had been in that same building for an appointment, an elderly, frail woman living with diabetes for years. That day, something went wrong. Her body failed, and her balance almost slipped away with it. He remembered the desperate call he received that afternoon. His mother had fallen ill in the lobby, surrounded by strangers who didn't know what to do. Then someone rushed to her without a second thought. It wasn't a doctor, a manager, or someone in a high position. It was a cleaning lady, calmly, firmly, and empathy. That woman knelt beside her and took control of the situation. Grace listened to Ethan speak and felt time rewind. She remembered that day clearly. The pale woman, her irregular breathing, her lost gaze. She remembered holding her hand, speaking slowly, asking for sugar, calling for help. For her, it wasn't a heroic act, it was instinct. Someone was in need, and that was enough. She never knew who that woman was. She never expected recognition. She simply did what seemed right. Ethan continued, now in a lower voice. He said that his mother always spoke of that employee with gratitude. She would comment on how kindness in his gaze. He saw the tranquility he felt in that moment. He had never connected the face to the name. Until now. Before him stood the same person who had just been discarded minutes before. The direction hit him hard. At that moment, Ethan understood something that deeply troubled him. The company that talked so much about values had let someone essential slip through the cracks. Not for lack of ability, but because prejudice, the system failed to see humanity where she was most alive. He felt a weight that was hard to ignore. This wasn't just a hiring mistake, it was a moral failing. Grace listened in silence, trying to process everything. She didn't feel excessive pride, nor did she seek validation. That situation only confirmed something she had always known. A person's worth doesn't appear in the position they hold. It appears in the choices they make when no one is watching. Still, realizing she had been judged so unfairly hurt, not for herself, but for what it said about the world, Ethan looked around, realizing that this revelation wasn't just personal, it was structural. The company had just rejected someone who represented everything they claimed to stand for. Respect, empathy, responsibility. He felt he needed to act, not later, not in reports, but now. That moment demanded more than reflection. It demanded action. Grace, standing there in the lobby, sensed that something was changing. I didn't know exactly what or in what direction. But he realized that this story was no longer just about a lost interview. It was about recognition, redemption, and a second chance that was beginning to take shape. The silence between them carried that tension, and the next step was about to expose everything that had been done wrong up to that point. Ethan didn't take the conversation to a private room, nor did he delay his reaction. He called the recruiters over right there in the lobby where everything was still happening. His voice was firm but controlled, without any theatrics. The people around realized that something serious was about to happen. The atmosphere changed in seconds. The murmur subsided and attention focused on that unlikely group. He asked directly why Grace had been rejected. He wanted to hear the criteria, the justifications, the official reasons. There was no irony in his voice, only a demand. The recruiters exchanged glances before answering, choosing their words with excessive care. They spoke of profile, alignment, requirements, generic terms that didn't say much. Ethan listened in silence, letting each explanation reveal more than it intended to hide. Then came the question no one expected to avoid. Why was someone clearly qualified dismissed so quickly? Why was her career path treated as a negative point, not as experience? He didn't mention positions or hierarchy. He spoke of human value, of respect, of coherence. The silence that followed was louder than any answer. There was no comfortable explanation for it. Embarrassment spread through the lobby like a slow wave, eyes averted, postures stiffened. Some people pretended not to hear. Others watched without disguising their curiosity. For the recruiters, that moment exposed more than an isolated decision. It displayed a pattern, a reflection of prejudice, which no one wanted to admit out loud. The company was being confronted with its own image. Grace remained there, feeling torn. Part of her wanted to disappear, to leave before things escalated. She didn't like being the center of attention, much less a public confrontation. Another part understood that something important was happening, and not just for her. This conversation went beyond her interview. It was about how many other people had been discarded in the same way. She gripped the strap of her bag tighter, trying to decide whether to stay or leave for good. She didn't want to seem like someone who needed defending. At the same time, she felt that leaving at that moment would mean giving up on something bigger. Her dignity. She was unharmed, but the situation demanded her presence. Grace took a deep breath, remaining silent. That, too, was a form of strength. Ethan sensed her tension and, for a moment, softened his tone. He said that this conversation wasn't about exposing anyone, but about correcting a mistake. He spoke of humanity and of responsibility, of how small decisions shape entire cultures. The lobby, once just a passageway, had become an uncomfortable mirror. Nothing there seemed casual anymore. Grace didn't know what the outcome of that confrontation would be. She didn't know if it would bring her any second chance or just another wound. She only knew that, for the first time, someone was questioning aloud the kind of judgment she had always faced in silence. And while she remained there, undecided between staying or leaving, the course of that story was still open. Ethan turned to Grace with a calm gesture, as if shifting the focus of an entire conversation. His voice didn't sound paternalistic or distant. It sounded honest. He said she didn't need pity or favors, just a fair chance, and he stated bluntly that he wanted to be the one to offer it. The lobby, still attentive, seemed to hold its breath. That sentence changed the weight of the moment. He explained that the company would offer paid training, structured to assess real-world, day-to-day skills. It wasn't an empty promise, nor a makeshift solution. There would be double pay from day one, full benefits, and insurance for Emily. Ethan made it clear that this wasn't a symbolic gesture, but a real commitment, opportunity. He spoke with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Even so, he didn't try to persuade. He simply presented the facts. Grace listened to everything in silence, feeling the impact of the words. Part of her wanted to accept immediately, overcome by hope. Another part remained alert, protected by years of difficult experiences. I had already seen offers that came with hidden expectations. I had already felt the weight of being used as an example, not as a person. Doubt took hold strongly. Was it real or just kindness performative? She thought about Emily, about how much that proposal would change their routine. She thought about the security, the time they'd spend together, the stability that had always seemed so distant. But she also thought about herself. Dignity. She didn't want to advance based on disguised charity. She wanted to earn her place through merit, not compassion. The line between support and condescension was too thin to ignore. Grace needed to be sure. Her silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was firm. Ethan noticed her hesitation and didn't interrupt her. On the contrary, he respected her time. He said that this opportunity didn't come from pity, but from recognition, that he believed in the value she had already demonstrated long before that interview. He spoke of respect and of responsibility. He promised no shortcuts, only justice. Grace felt something reorganize itself within her. For the first time, someone in a position of power was speaking to her, not about her. That touched her deeply, self-worth in a profound way. Still, the fear didn't disappear. Fear of exposing herself, of trusting, of being disappointed again. Life had taught her to be cautious. Accepting that turn of events required more courage than refusing. She looked around, feeling the eyes still fixed on her. This decision wasn't just professional, it was personal. A step that could lead her to redemption or to a new frustration. Grace took a deep breath, aware that she couldn't run away forever. That was the second chance. She had so often questioned whether she deserved it, and now she needed to decide what she would do with it. As the lobby slowly returned to its rhythm, Grace's answer still hadn't come. The proposal was there, clear, concrete, waiting. And in that space of hesitation, something important was being tested. Not just her confidence, but the promise that this turnaround wouldn't be just talk. The next step would define everything. Grace accepted the offer without long speeches, only with a firm nod and a sincere thank you. Inside, however, she made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't occupy that space out of exception, nor out of pity. She would conquer everything through merit, step by step. That decision didn't erase the fear, but it set it in motion. It was the beginning of a test that she knew would be closely watched. The training began in the following days, in an environment completely new to her. Administrative routines, internal systems, direct customer service, responsibilities that demanded constant attention. Grace immersed herself in the learning process with humility and focus. She asked questions, took notes, observed more than she spoke. She didn't try to prove anything, she just did the job well. Her demeanor subtly drew attention. Quickly, her ability to deal with people began to stand out. When someone got angry, she remained calm. When a problem arose, she listened before responding. That empathy, the skills she had developed throughout her life, proved invaluable. Colleagues noticed that conflicts were resolved more quickly around her. It wasn't technique, it was sensitivity, something that can't be learned in formal training. Not everyone reacted the same way. Some colleagues watched with suspicion, silently questioning his presence there. Quiet comments, quick glances, unspoken doubts. The prejudice, it doesn't disappear overnight. Grace felt this, but she didn't confront it. She preferred to let her work speak for itself. Resilience. The one who had brought her there was now supporting her. Others, however, approached her differently. Inspired by the story that was beginning to circulate, they saw in her an unexpected role model, someone who didn't follow the traditional path, but still delivered results. Grace didn't present herself as an example, but her presence already taught something. That competence doesn't have a single format, that humanity, it is also a professional skill. She arrived early, left tired, but satisfied. Each small advance reinforced her self-worth. Still, Grace wasn't deluded. She knew that period was just a phase. True recognition hadn't yet been achieved. The company was watching her, the system was testing her, and not everyone was rooting for her. This kept her on her toes. Deep down, Grace sensed that something bigger was approaching. A moment that would demand everything she had learned, not just in training, but in life. This phase was shaping her preparedness, not just evaluating her performance. The road to this point had been tough, but it wasn't the climax yet. The greatest test was still to come. The conference brought together investors, partners, and key executives, and the reception area was busier than ever. Everything seemed to be going according to plan until, without warning, the system crashed. Screens froze, credentials didn't work, and lines began to form rapidly. The atmosphere changed in seconds. Voices rose, expressions of impatience appeared, and control seemed to slip through the team's fingers. It was the kind of situation that exposes weaknesses. Grace was there, observing, when she realized that no one was taking the lead. Instead of waiting for orders, she stepped forward. She asked for calm, spoke clearly, and began to organize the flow of people. She prioritized tasks, guided colleagues, and offered temporary alternatives. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was confident. The posture brought stability amidst the chaos. She didn't need a title to lead. While technicians tried to resolve the problem, Grace kept the guests informed, always with respect. He looked her in the eyes, explained the situation, and asked for a few minutes. His empathy, he transformed frustration into understanding. The atmosphere slowly adjusted. Where there had been tension before, there was now patience. People who'd been complaining minutes earlier began to cooperate. The reception area began to breathe again. When the system was finally restored, the impact had already been made. The conference continued, but something had changed. Colleagues looked at Grace with a different perspective. She was no longer the trainee. She was someone reliable under pressure. She didn't celebrate. She just kept working. For her, it was simply doing what needed to be done. But the effect was profound. On the other side of the room, Ethan watched everything in silence. He observed how Grace handled the situation, without haste, without anxiety. He saw there the confirmation of what he already felt: courage, perseverance, and humanity in action. A discreet smile appeared on his face, not of personal satisfaction, but of recognition. That choice had been the right one. The news spread quickly behind the scenes. People commented on her calm demeanor, her poise, her unexpected solution. The respect she earned at that moment didn't come from speeches, but from action. Grace felt it in the air, even without anyone saying anything directly. For the first time, there was no doubt in their eyes. She had proven her worth. It was no longer possible to deny what was before everyone's eyes. It was not a matter of second chance given by someone powerful. It was merit earned under pressure, a redemption. It didn't come as a prize, it came as a consequence. That scene brought to a close a cycle that began silently in the invisible hours of work. Grace took a deep breath at the end of the event, feeling a different kind of tiredness, a tiredness mixed with pride. This wasn't just a professional victory, it was a life lesson. There were still paths to travel, but something essential had been established. And in that instant, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. A few weeks later, Grace is officially hired as an administrative assistant. She arrives at work early in the morning, now through the same lobby she used to clean at night. People greet her with respect. Ethan walks by and waves discreetly, not like a savior, but like someone who has learned from her what it means to see beyond appearances. Grace sends a message to her daughter. "Daughter, Mommy didn't conquer the world, but she never gave up." She smiles, looks out the window and thinks, sometimes what changes someone's life isn't being chosen, it's finally being seen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel right now. Stories like Grace's remind us that human worth should never be measured by labels. Share this video with someone who needs to believe in themselves again, and leave a comment saying, "I believe in second chances."